Debt. Why the rich embrace it and the poor fear it. Chapter 1. The Two Faces of Debt. Debt is a word that stirs emotions. For some, it conjures fear, anxiety, and sleepless nights, as if chains were being fastened around their ankles. For others, it represents freedom, opportunity, and the ability to control vast resources with little of their own money at stake. You have probably felt both sides of this tension at some point, and the way you interpret debt may be one of the most important choices in your financial life. It is not the number itself, not the loan agreement or the interest rate that defines whether debt will enslave you or liberate you, but the posture with which you approach it. When you think of a family drowning in credit card balances, you see one face of debt. The husband and wife swipe their plastic cards for groceries, gas, and small pleasures, telling themselves they will catch up next month. But the month comes and goes, and instead of catching up, they fall further behind. The balance grows, the minimum payment creeps higher, and the sense of guilt gnaws at them. They are paying for the past instead of investing in the future. The child asks for a new pair of sneakers, and the parents hesitate, knowing the purchase will be added to a balance already larger than their monthly income. This is the face of debt most people know, the face that haunts. But there is another family, not necessarily wealthier to begin with, who sees debt as a lever instead of a shackle. They use a bank's money to purchase an apartment building worth $200,000, putting down only $20,000 of their own. The tenant's rent covers the mortgage, the expenses, and leaves them with a profit every month. Over the years, the debt shrinks while the property grows in value. By the time their children are grown, that $20,000 investment may have turned into an asset worth $300,000 or more, with the loan almost paid off by people they never met. To them, debt is not a punishment, but a partner. A silent ally that accelerates the growth of their wealth. The difference between these two families is not intelligence or luck. It is perspective. One sees borrowing as a desperate attempt to maintain a lifestyle that outpaces income, while the other sees borrowing as a bridge to acquire assets that will eventually generate income greater than the cost of the loan itself. The poor fear debt because they have only seen it as a trap. The rich embrace debt because they have learned to make it serve their goals. The numbers are the same, the contracts are similar, but the intention behind them changes everything. There is a small-town story that illustrates this perfectly. In the early 1990s, a young man named Robert was working in a hardware store, earning just over $400 a week. He saved diligently, but could not imagine affording a property of his own. One day, an older customer, who happened to be a landlord, told him, "You don't need to buy with your money. You need to buy with the banks." Intrigued, Robert scraped together $5,000 in savings, borrowed $45,000 more, and bought a small duplex. Within a year, the rent from tenants paid for the mortgage and left him with an extra $100 each month. His friends thought he was crazy for taking on so much debt, but 10 years later, that duplex was worth more than $120,000, and his tenants had paid off most of his original loan. What looked like danger was, in fact, opportunity. When you hear these stories, you realize debt is not moral or immoral, good or evil. It is neutral, like fire. Fire can warm your home or burn it to the ground. Debt can imprison you in obligations that consume your future earnings, or it can free you to build wealth far greater than you could ever accumulate on your own. The tool itself does not decide its outcome. You do. That realization alone can shift the way you look at every financial decision from this moment forward. Imagine standing at a crossroads. On one path, you see people dragging heavy loads, bent under the weight of obligations they cannot escape. On the other path, you see others walking light, seemingly pulling carts of gold that are not even theirs. Both groups are using debt, yet the outcomes are worlds apart. What separates them is not chance or hidden privilege, but the way they learn to interact with borrowed money. Debt reveals its true nature only after you decide how to use it. For many, debt begins with consumption. A young couple, excited about their first apartment, fills it with new furniture bought on store credit. They promise themselves they will pay it off quickly, But the payments stretch on for years, and the furniture loses value while the interest compounds. The couple thinks they are building a life, but in truth they are mortgaging their future for items that will soon be worthless. This is the dark face of debt. It tempts you into instant gratification, then quietly drains your wealth, long after the excitement has faded. Contrast that with another young couple starting from the same modest income. Instead of buying on credit, they live sparsely, saving $10,000 over 2 years. With this savings, they secure a loan for a small food truck costing $50,000. The loan feels daunting, but within months, the business is generating daily cash flow. Customers pay cash for meals, and the couple uses that money to cover the loan payments while keeping a portion as profit. Over 5 years, they not only repay the debt, but also expand to 2 more trucks. By the end of a decade, they own a small chain valued at over $500,000. Their debt did not burden them. It multiplied their possibilities. The critical distinction lies in whether the debt is attached to something that gains or loses value. Borrowing for a car that depreciates from $25,000 to $12,000 within a few years while you still owe most of the loan is financial quicksand. Borrowing the same amount to acquire a delivery van that generates income every week is financial leverage. The numbers on paper may look the same, but the results are dramatically different. One drains you, the other feeds you. I once heard a story about a woman named Elena who worked as a nurse in a busy city hospital. She earned a steady income, but like many, she lived paycheck to paycheck. She had grown up in a household where debt was spoken of as something shameful, a sign of irresponsibility. Then, in her early 30s, she stumbled upon a seminar about real estate investing. Skeptical but curious, she attended. And the speaker explained how banks were willing to lend large sums against property because property was a stable, tangible asset. Elena decided to test the idea. She borrowed $90,000 with a $10,000 down payment to buy a small house near the hospital. She rented it out to fellow nurses, and the rent covered the mortgage, with $200 left over each month. That was the first time she realized debt could be a tool, not a trap. 10 years later, Elena owned 4 properties worth nearly $500,000. The same woman who once feared debt as a curse had turned it into her ladder to financial independence. When you see both sides of debt, you begin to recognize its dual personality. It can whisper lies that keep you enslaved to consumerism, or it can open doors to opportunities that would otherwise remain locked. Most people never learn to separate these two faces, and so they treat all debt as dangerous. But if you strip away the fear, you will find that debt does not create poverty or wealth on its own. It only magnifies the choices you make. Used carelessly, it magnifies mistakes until they feel crushing. Used wisely, it magnifies smart decisions until they transform your life. And that is why the rich embrace debt without hesitation, while the poor shy away from it. They have learned that the key is not to avoid borrowing altogether, but to borrow with purpose. They do not see debt as an enemy, but as an instrument, like a violin. In untrained hands, the violin screeches painfully. In skilled hands, it produces music that can fill a hall. The instrument itself never changes, only the way it is played. Chapter 2. The Psychology of Borrowing. Fear and confidence often begin in the mind long before they show up in numbers. Debt is no exception. Before you sign a loan document or swipe a credit card, your beliefs and emotions about borrowing shape the decision. If you grew up hearing your parents argue about overdue bills, you may feel your stomach twist whenever debt is mentioned. If, instead, you watched someone build a business by leveraging bank money, you may feel excitement when taking on a loan. The psychology of borrowing is not about the mathematics of interest rates or amortization tables. It is about the stories you tell yourself and the emotions you carry when you step into the world of credit. Consider the way debt often represents shame. A man owes $5,000 on a credit card. Rationally, this is not an impossible burden. He earns $3,000 a month, and if he adjusted his spending, he could pay it off within 2 years. But emotionally, the debt feels like a scarlet letter. He avoids looking at statements, dodges phone calls, and dreads opening his mailbox. His fear is not of the numbers, but of what they say about him. Debt, to him, is proof of failure. And so, instead of confronting it directly, he lets the balance grow, adding interest to anxiety until both become overwhelming. Now imagine another man in a similar situation. He too carries $5,000 of credit card debt, but he interprets it differently. He sees it as a temporary setback, a challenge to be solved rather than a life sentence. He calls the credit card company, negotiates a lower rate, and sets up an automatic payment plan that gradually reduces the balance. The number on paper is the same as the first man's, but the mindset is radically different. One man feels crushed, the other feels in control. This divergence is entirely psychological, yet it determines who will escape and who will remain trapped. The wealthy often cultivate a psychological distance from debt that prevents panic. They view borrowed money as a tool outside themselves, not as a reflection of their worth. If a business venture fails, they write off the loss, restructure the debt, and move forward. They do not interpret the failure as a personal defect, but as a natural risk of playing the game of money. This detachment allows them to make bold moves where others would freeze in fear. It is not that the wealthy never feel nervous about borrowing, but they have trained themselves to see beyond the short-term discomfort toward the long-term opportunity. There is a revealing story about a woman named Teresa who owned a small bakery in the early 2000s. When her oven broke, she faced a choice: close her doors temporarily and save up for a replacement, or take out a $20,000 loan to buy a new industrial oven immediately. Her friends warned her about the dangers of debt. They reminded her of stories where people had borrowed and lost everything. Teresa listened, but asked herself a different question. What was the cost of not borrowing? Without the oven, her bakery would close for months, and she would lose her loyal customers. With a loan, she could continue operating and even increase her production capacity. Teresa chose to borrow. Within 3 years, she had paid off the loan and doubled her sales. Her friends continued to fear debt, but Teresa understood that her ability to reframe borrowing in her mind had saved and expanded her business. The psychology of debt is not just about optimism. It is about perspective. When you look at debt as a weapon that could turn against you, you remain paralyzed. When you see it as an extension of your strategy, you wield it carefully but confidently. This mental framing is what separates those who are consumed by interest payments from those who use loans to multiply their opportunities. Debt does not care about your emotions, but your emotions will determine how you respond to it. And in that response lies your financial future. Every financial decision is colored by the emotions you attach to it, and debt is the clearest mirror of this truth. If you believe borrowing equals danger, you will hesitate, even when opportunities stand directly before you. If you believe debt is a ladder, you will climb quickly, but perhaps too recklessly, without noticing the rungs that crack beneath your feet. The secret is not to be entirely fearful or entirely fearless, but to cultivate an emotional balance that allows you to act rationally, without paralysis and without blind faith. Fear of debt is often inherited. You may remember your parents lowering their voices when bills arrived, or you may recall the heavy silence after a collector's phone call. Those moments leave an imprint, teaching you that debt means crisis, instability, and shame. Without realizing it, you carry that memory into adulthood. Even when your financial circumstances improve, the shadow of that fear lingers. You avoid credit, you distrust banks, and you miss opportunities to expand because the word loan feels poisonous. The past has written your financial script. On the other hand, reckless comfort with debt is also inherited. A young man grows up watching his parents buy cars, vacations, and electronics on credit, never worrying about repayment until the letters turn red. He learns that debt is normal, even trivial. By the time he reaches his 20s, he is juggling multiple cards, personal loans, and car payments, all justified with the phrase, "Everyone does it." For him, debt is not shame but habit. and the result is just as dangerous as paralyzing fear. When the economy shifts or his job disappears, the mountain of obligations collapses on him. His psychology led him not to avoid but to embrace, without caution. There is a middle ground, a mindset that treats debt as a tool that requires respect. Think of it as driving a powerful car. Some people are so afraid they never get behind the wheel. They walk everywhere and remain limited in how far they can go. Others drive recklessly, ignoring the speedometer, until they crash. The wise driver learns how to steer, when to accelerate, and when to brake. The car itself is neither safe nor dangerous. It depends entirely on the driver. Debt works the same way. Take the case of James, a teacher in his late 30s. He earned a modest salary and carried a small amount of student debt. For years, he believed that all borrowing was bad, so he focused only on repaying his loans. Once he was free of debt, he felt proud but also frustrated. His savings grew slowly, and inflation eroded his purchasing power. Then a mentor explained that not all debt was the same. Encouraged, James applied for a loan of $70,000 to buy a duplex. The rent not only covered the mortgage, but added $300 a month to his income. The first year, James barely slept, convinced he had made a terrible mistake. But as the payments flowed smoothly, his fear transformed into confidence. By the time he bought his second property, his psychology had shifted entirely. He no longer saw debt as a curse, but as a partner he had learned to manage. What James discovered is what many wealthy individuals already know. Debt magnifies your inner world. If you are anxious and avoidant, debt will amplify that anxiety until it cripples you. If you are reckless and impulsive, debt will amplify your recklessness until it destroys you. But if you cultivate patience, discipline, and clarity, debt will amplify those qualities and reward you with growth you could never achieve alone. The numbers on the contract are neutral. Your mind is not. Your psychology is the lens, and debt only shines through it in whatever color that lens provides. Chapter 3. The Mechanics of Good Debt. When you first hear the phrase, good debt, it might sound like a contradiction. How can something that carries interest payments, obligations, and risks ever be called good? Yet the truth is that not all debt is created equal, and learning to distinguish between the debt that builds your wealth and the debt that drains it is one of the most powerful lessons you can master. The mechanics of good debt are simple in theory but profound in practice, and once you see them clearly, you will never look at borrowing the same way again. At its core, good debt is debt that pays for itself. It is money borrowed not to consume but to produce, not to satisfy desires in the present, but to create streams of value in the future. Imagine two people, each borrowing $10,000. One spends the money on a vacation to Europe, returning home with memories, photographs, and an empty wallet. The other uses the same $10,000 as a down payment on a small vending machine route, placing machines in office buildings where employees buy snacks every day. Within a year, the vending business generates $2,000 in profit, which goes toward repaying the loan. After 5 years, the debt is gone, but the machines continue to produce income indefinitely. The borrowed money became seed capital for a lasting asset. The mechanism behind good debt rests on a simple calculation. Does the borrowed money generate more than it costs? If the answer is yes, you are dealing with leverage that builds wealth. If the answer is no, you are digging a hole deeper with every payment. This is why the same dollar figure can mean disaster for one person and opportunity for another. Borrowing $50,000 for a luxury car that loses value the moment it leaves the dealership is destructive. Borrowing the same amount to buy equipment that produces $55,000 in annual revenue is constructive. The numbers alone never tell the story. The direction of cash flow does. A concrete example can make this even clearer. Suppose you take out a loan of $100,000 to purchase a 4-unit apartment building. The bank requires a 20% down payment, so you invest $20,000 of your own money and borrow the remaining $80,000. Each unit rents for $600 per month, producing $2,400 in monthly income. After paying the mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, you are left with $500 each month in positive cash flow. In this scenario, your tenants are paying down your loan while you collect profit. Over time, the building appreciates in value, perhaps reaching $150,000 within a decade. Your original $20,000 investment has grown several times over, all because you used debt to acquire an income-producing asset. The wealthy understand this principle intuitively. They do not ask, "Can I afford this loan?" They ask, "Will this loan afford me something greater?" The poor often approach debt with a consumer mindset, thinking in terms of immediate possession. The rich approach debt with an investor mindset, thinking in terms of future returns. It is the same system, the same banks, the same contracts, yet the mechanics work in opposite ways, depending on the direction of the borrowed funds. There is a story of a young couple named Adrian and Maria, who decided to invest in a small laundromat. They borrowed $60,000 from a local credit union, secured by the machines they purchased. At first, their families worried. Why take on so much debt for a risky venture? But Adrian and Maria ran the numbers carefully. The laundromat brought in nearly $3,000 each month, and after expenses and loan payments, they still had a net income of $800. Within 5 years, the loan was fully paid. The machine still spun, the quarters still dropped, and the couple enjoyed a steady income stream. Their debt had been temporary, but the asset it created continued to reward them for years. Good debt, then, is not about the size of the loan or the prestige of the bank. It is about aligning borrowed money with assets that create value. Once you see the mechanics clearly, you begin to understand why the rich are unafraid to borrow millions, while the poor hesitate to borrow thousands. One group knows how to make debt work for them. The other only knows how debt works against them. To truly grasp the mechanics of good debt, you need to look beyond the surface and into the flow of money over time. Every dollar you borrow is a seed. If planted in barren ground, it will rot and leave you poorer than before. If planted in fertile soil, it will multiply into a harvest far greater than the original amount. The difference lies not in the seed itself, but in the field you choose. Good debt works because it is deliberately placed into fields that yield returns, while bad debt is squandered on ground that produces nothing. One of the most important elements of good debt is leverage. Leverage is the ability to control a large asset with a small amount of your own money. Imagine standing in front of a seesaw with a heavy stone on one end. On your own, you cannot lift it. But with a long enough plank and the right fulcrum, you can move it easily. Debt is that lever. Without it, you may spend decades trying to save enough to buy a property, a business, or equipment. With it, you can take control immediately, paying back the cost over time while the asset works for you. This is why wealthy individuals rarely wait until they have enough cash to purchase outright. They understand that every year of delay is a year of lost income, lost appreciation, and lost opportunity. Consider the mathematics of leverage in a real scenario. Suppose you save up $50,000 in cash. You could use it to buy one modest rental property outright, generating perhaps $400 of net monthly income. Alternatively, you could use the same $50,000 as down payments on 5 different properties, borrowing the remainder through bank loans. Each property might net only $200 per month after expenses, but multiplied across 5 properties, your total income becomes $1,000 monthly. At the same time, tenants are steadily paying down your loans, and property values are likely to rise. In 10 years, you may own 5 appreciating assets instead of 1, all because you allowed debt to extend your reach. This is the hidden power of good debt. It multiplies your limited resources into something far larger than you could ever achieve alone. Of course, leverage must be handled with care. A farmer who borrows heavily to plant crops takes on risk, because a drought or flood could wipe out the harvest. But without borrowing, he may never expand beyond subsistence farming. The wealthy accept that risk is inseparable from opportunity. They use analysis, strategy, and patience to manage that risk, rather than avoiding it altogether. They know that the cost of never borrowing is often greater than the cost of borrowing wisely. There is a story of Daniel, a mechanic who dreamed of owning his own garage. For years, he saved bits of his paycheck, managing to accumulate $15,000. He considered waiting until he had enough to buy equipment outright, which would have taken another decade. Instead, he used his savings as collateral for a $70,000 loan. With the funds, he opened a small repair shop in a rented space. Within 2 years, his customer base was strong, and his net income, after paying the loan, exceeded what he had ever earned as an employee. By the 5th year, the loan was fully repaid, and he had expanded into a larger facility. Had Daniel waited until he could avoid all debt, his dream might have withered before it even began. The mechanics of good debt are not complex, yet they require a shift in thinking. You must ask yourself with every loan, will this create more income than it costs? Will it leave me with an asset that grows in value rather than shrinks? Will it expand my opportunities instead of limiting them? These questions turn debt from a blind gamble into a strategic move. When answered honestly, they reveal whether a loan will become a chain or a set of wings. This is why the rich embrace debt as an ally. They see numbers in motion, not as static burdens, but as dynamic forces. They understand that good debt is temporary, but the wealth it creates can last for generations. And once you learn to apply the same mechanics in your own life, you begin to see debt not as something to fear, but as something to master, a current you can ride instead of resist. Chapter 4. Stories of the Wealthy. Numbers and theories can feel distant until they are clothed in human lives. To understand why the wealthy embrace debt with such confidence, you need to walk through their stories. To see how decisions that might terrify most people became the foundation of fortunes. Wealth does not appear overnight, nor is it built only on savings or strokes of luck. More often than not, it emerges from a willingness to borrow boldly and strategically, to harness the resources of others in order to accelerate growth. One striking example is the story of a man named Leonard. In the late 1970s, Leonard was a young real estate agent with little capital of his own. He saw an aging apartment building listed for $250,000, far beyond his personal savings. Most people would have sighed and walked away, but Leonard understood leverage. He convinced a local bank to lend him $200,000, offering his car and small savings account as additional collateral. With his own $50,000 scraped together from friends and family, he bought the building. The first year was stressful, with repairs and tenant turnover, but the rents covered the mortgage. 10 years later, the property was worth more than $800,000, and Leonard had built equity of nearly $500,000. His relatives, who once thought he was reckless, began asking for advice. The building had not just provided income, it had reshaped his entire financial destiny. Another story unfolds with a woman named Grace. She worked in publishing for most of her 20s, but always dreamed of owning a bookstore. The problem was capital. Opening even a modest shop required inventory, rent, and marketing that added up to more than $100,000. Grace had saved only $20,000. Rather than give up, she secured an $80,000 business loan. Friends warned her that borrowing for a bookstore in the digital age was madness. But Grace was strategic. She placed her shop in a college town, focusing on rare editions, academic texts, and hosting community events. Within 3 years, the store's revenue had doubled her loan amount, and she had expanded into online sales. A decade later, Grace owned not only a thriving shop, but also the building it occupied, valued at over $500,000. What looked like a dangerous risk had become the cornerstone of her independence. These stories illustrate a crucial pattern. Wealthy individuals do not borrow to consume. They borrow to create. Debt is never taken for fleeting pleasure, but for assets that either generate income or grow in value. This is why they can borrow large sums with calm assurance. They are not gambling. They are investing with a plan that bends debt to their advantage. One more example can be found in the life of Jorge, an immigrant who arrived in the United States with little more than determination. He worked long hours in construction, saving what he could, but progress was slow. A coworker suggested he buy a small duplex and rent half while living in the other. Jorge borrowed $90,000 with a $10,000 down payment. At first, the payments stretched him thin, and he wondered if he had made a mistake. But the rental income covered more than half of his mortgage, and within a few years, rising property values turned his $10,000 investment into equity worth over $50,000. Encouraged, he repeated the process with a second property. By his mid-40s, Jorge owned several buildings and enjoyed an income that far exceeded his construction wages. His success was not built on extraordinary talent, but on a decision to use debt as a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. What ties Leonard Grace and Jorge together is not wealth at the start, but courage, vision, and an understanding of how to make debt serve them. Each faced skepticism, each endured fear, and each risked failure. Yet by borrowing with purpose, they transformed their lives. Their stories remind you that debt is not reserved for the privileged. It is accessible to anyone willing to study, strategize, and step forward despite the doubts. The stories of the wealthy often sound larger than life, yet most of them begin with ordinary people who simply chose to view debt differently. What separates them from those who drown in obligations is not luck or inheritance, but an intentional use of borrowed money as a lever to build something lasting. When you trace their journeys, you see a common thread: courage at the beginning, discipline in the middle, and patience at the end. Take the case of Eleanor, a schoolteacher in her late 20s who loved baking. She dreamed of owning a cafe but had only $10,000 saved. The idea of borrowing terrified her, yet she could not ignore the thought of turning her passion into a business. After months of hesitation, she took out a $60,000 loan to open a modest bakery in a busy downtown neighborhood. The first year nearly broke her. Rent, utilities, and payroll often outpaced revenue. But instead of folding, Eleanor doubled down, reinvesting every spare dollar and negotiating with suppliers to reduce costs. By the third year, her bakery was profitable, and by the seventh, she had opened a second location. Today, the business is valued at nearly $1 million. What looked like an unbearable risk in her 20s became her financial foundation in her 40s. Another story belongs to Charles, a former military mechanic who noticed that small trucking companies often struggled to afford reliable repair services. He decided to open a specialized shop catering to their needs, but the equipment alone cost more than $100,000. With only $15,000 saved, Charles secured a bank loan for the rest. Friends warned him against such a heavy debt load, but Charles understood his niche. Within 2 years, his reputation attracted steady business, and his shop generated revenues well above his loan payments. 5 years later, he expanded into fleet management, eventually owning a company worth several million. The same debt that would have frightened others became the tool that allowed him to create opportunities not only for himself, but also for dozens of employees. Stories like Eleanor's and Charles's highlight another trait of the wealthy. They see debt as temporary, but assets as permanent. They know the pain of repayment will eventually pass, while the asset will continue producing long after the loan is gone. This long view allows them to endure the discomfort of debt without losing sight of the reward. There is also the story of Malik, who grew up in a working-class neighborhood where debt was seen only as a trap. Yet Malik was curious. He noticed a dilapidated 4-unit building for sale at $120,000. Everyone he knew laughed at the idea of buying it, pointing out the peeling paint and broken windows. But Malik saw potential. With a small down payment of $15,000 and a loan for the remainder, he took the plunge. He spent weekends repairing units, painting walls, and fixing plumbing. Within a year, the building was fully rented, generating enough income not only to cover the mortgage, but to fund improvements. 10 years later, the building was worth more than 3 times his purchase price. Malik had turned debt from a feared enemy into a loyal servant. What unites all these stories is not perfection, but persistence. Every wealthy borrower has faced sleepless nights, setbacks, and doubts. But unlike those who feared debt, they kept their eyes on the asset, not the obligation. They understood that debt is a passage, not a destination. And once you see debt in this way, you begin to realize that the real difference between those who thrive and those who struggle lies not in opportunity alone, but in the courage to use debt as a tool rather than avoid it as a curse. Chapter 5. The Cost of Avoidance. If the wealthy show you what happens when debt is embraced with strategy, then the opposite reveals itself just as clearly in the lives of those who avoid debt altogether. On the surface, the choice seems wise. No loans, no creditors, no interest payments, no risk. But when you look deeper, you find a hidden cost. Avoiding debt often means avoiding opportunity. It is like refusing to plant a seed because you fear the weather, only to watch others harvest fields of abundance while you remain empty-handed. Think of a man named Samuel. He worked diligently in a factory, earning a steady income for over 20 years. He distrusted banks and never borrowed a dollar in his life. Every paycheck, he tucked away a small amount into savings, proud that he was free of obligations. By the time he reached his 50s, he had accumulated nearly $60,000. It felt like an achievement, and in many ways, it was. Yet when he compared himself to a colleague who had borrowed to buy rental property, the difference was staggering. That colleague had started with less savings but now owned assets worth over $500,000, producing monthly income greater than Samuel's factory wage. Samuel was safe, but safety had a cost. Decades of missed growth. Avoidance of debt traps many into dependence on wages. They cling to the security of a paycheck because they have never built anything that generates income on its own. Each week is consumed by work, and each month by bills. They tell themselves they are responsible for never owing anyone, yet their entire life is owed to their employer. The absence of financial risk has not freed them. It has chained them to labor. Without debt, they never gained the leverage that could have multiplied their savings into assets. Another example comes from Patricia, a woman who dreamed of opening a daycare center. She loved children, had years of experience, and even identified a perfect location near her neighborhood. The cost to start was modest compared to many businesses, around $35,000. But Patricia had only $10,000 saved. She considered applying for a loan to cover the difference, yet fear of debt stopped her. Instead, she continued working long hours at someone else's daycare, earning barely enough to cover her expenses. 10 years passed, and the opportunity slipped away. When she looked back, she realized she had spent a decade building someone else's dream instead of her own. Her refusal to borrow had not protected her. It had stolen time she could never recover. The psychology of avoidance often masquerades as wisdom. People say, "I will wait until I can pay in full," or "I do not want the stress of owing money." On the surface, these statements sound prudent, but beneath them lies a fear that paralyzes progress. Waiting until you can pay in full often means waiting forever, because the goalpost keeps moving. Inflation raises costs, opportunities disappear, and life's responsibilities consume your savings. By the time you finally have enough, the chance to act has long passed. There is a saying that the poor pay with time what the wealthy pay with money. Refusing debt forces you to rely solely on your own labor, your own years, and your own savings. But your time is limited, your income capped, and your energy finite. Debt, when used wisely, allows you to compress decades of effort into a few short years by letting borrowed capital do the heavy lifting. Avoidance may feel safe, but in truth, it is often the most expensive choice of all. To avoid debt entirely may seem like choosing freedom, but in reality, it often means choosing limitation. By refusing to borrow, you may protect yourself from mistakes, yet you also deny yourself access to the very tools that build wealth. It is like locking yourself in a room to avoid storms. You stay dry, but you never see the horizon. Consider the story of Helen, who worked as a nurse for 30 years. She was proud to say she never borrowed a cent, not even for a car. She saved diligently, and by the time she retired, she had $120,000 in the bank. Yet when she stopped working, she discovered that her savings barely covered her living expenses. She had no assets generating income, only a pile of cash that shrank each year. Her discipline was admirable, but her fear of debt had kept her from investing in real estate or a business when she had the chance. By contrast, a colleague who had taken on mortgages to purchase small rental homes retired with multiple streams of income and assets that grew in value even as she slept. Helen had avoided debt, but she had also avoided the possibility of true financial independence. The cost of avoidance often appears in mistiming. Opportunities do not wait for you to save enough. They pass by and are seized by those willing to act with borrowed capital. A man who waits 20 years to buy a property in cash enters the market at a higher price, losing decades of rental income and appreciation. Another who buys with a loan early, even with less capital, benefits from tenants paying off his mortgage while property values rise. By the time the saver finally acts, the borrower has already multiplied his wealth. What looked like patience was, in fact, delay. Another story illustrates this with painful clarity. Carlos was a talented carpenter who dreamed of opening his own workshop. He had clients waiting, contacts in the construction industry, and a reputation for skill. But he refused to borrow the $50,000 he needed to buy equipment and lease space. Instead, he continued working for others, always saying he would save enough next year. Years turned into decades, and by the time he had enough cash, his energy and health had declined. The opportunity was gone. The clients who once urged him to open his shop had found other suppliers. Carlos had avoided debt, but the price was a lifetime of building someone else's wealth instead of his own. The irony is that people often avoid debt because they fear losing control, yet in avoiding it they surrender control to others. Employers dictate their wages, landlords dictate their rent, and inflation dictates the shrinking value of their savings. Debt, used strategically, could have allowed them to buy assets that placed them in control, but avoidance leaves them at the mercy of forces beyond their power. You begin to see that the greatest danger is not falling into debt, but never learning how to master it. By treating all borrowing as poisonous, people cut themselves off from the chance to harness leverage, to expand, and to grow. The wealthy understand that risk cannot be eliminated, it can only be managed. Those who avoid debt entirely pay the hidden cost of forfeited dreams, missed opportunities, and years of labor that could have been transformed into ownership. Chapter 6. Mastering the Game. By now, you have seen both faces of debt, the chains that bind and the wings that lift. You have also seen how fear can rob you of opportunity, while reckless comfort can destroy you just as quickly. To master the game of debt is not to reject it nor to surrender blindly to it, but to take control of it, to shape it into a tool that serves your vision rather than sabotages it. Mastery begins not with money but with mindset, because the way you think about debt determines the way you use it. The first step in mastery is clarity. You must know with absolute certainty whether a loan is feeding your future or stealing from it. This means tracing every borrowed dollar forward, asking where it will go and what it will return. If a loan buys something that loses value the moment you take possession, such as a brand new car or expensive gadgets, you already know the result. Years of repayment for something that will be worth almost nothing. But if that same borrowed money is directed towards something that produces cash flow or appreciates in value, you have planted a seed that will grow. Mastery is nothing more than the discipline to make this distinction consistently. The second step is discipline. Even good debt can turn against you if you lack the patience to manage it. Wealthy individuals understand that debt requires steady attention, payments made on time, reserves set aside for the unexpected, and reinvestment of profits instead of reckless spending. Without discipline, even the best opportunity can unravel. With discipline, even a modest loan can transform into a fortune. There is a story of a man named Victor who borrowed $100,000 to purchase a small commercial property. The rent covered the mortgage, but instead of pocketing the leftover cash for lifestyle upgrades, he reinvested every dollar into repairs and improvements. Over 10 years, He renovated the property, raised its rental value, and eventually sold it for 3 times what he had paid. His discipline turned a single loan into a stepping stone for further investments. Had he spent the profits on vacations or cars, the loan would have been nothing more than a burden. The third step is vision. Mastering debt means knowing where you want it to take you. Without vision, you risk borrowing aimlessly, chasing short-term gains, or copying others without understanding their strategy. Vision allows you to see debt not as a momentary transaction, but as part of a larger path. Do you want to build passive income through real estate? Do you want to expand a business? Do you want to acquire education or skills that multiply your earning potential? Each requires debt to be used differently, and without a clear vision, you will never know which debts are worth carrying. Consider Sophia, a young woman who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Medical school required loans of over $200,000, a number that frightened many of her peers. But Sophia saw the long view. She treated the debt as an investment in her future earning potential. Years later, as a practicing physician, she repaid her loans comfortably while earning several times more than she ever could have without them. Her vision gave meaning to her debt, transforming what looked like a crushing burden into a rational step on her journey. Clarity, discipline, and vision. These are the mental pillars that turn debt from master into servant. Without them, you drift between fear and recklessness, either avoiding opportunities or drowning in obligations. With them, you navigate the financial world with the confidence of someone who knows exactly how to use the tools at hand. Debt becomes no longer something to fear, but something to command, a force that amplifies your strengths instead of your weaknesses. To master the game of debt is to understand that it is never about the loan itself, but about the story you write with it. Every signature on a contract is a fork in the road, one path leading to burden, the other to opportunity. What determines the outcome is not luck, but preparation, intention, and the courage to act with wisdom. The wealthy are not born knowing how to wield debt. They learn, often through mistakes, but always with the understanding that borrowed money is not an enemy, but a partner waiting to be directed. Mastery requires that you learn to separate emotion from decision. Fear whispers that debt will ruin you, while recklessness shouts that more is always better. Both voices are dangerous. The quiet voice of mastery says, "Does this debt serve my vision? Does it produce more than it costs? Does it move me closer to independence rather than further into dependence?" These questions act as a compass, guiding you through the noise of opinion and the lure of instant gratification. One vivid example is Marcus, who dreamed of building a chain of gyms. His first loan was for $150,000, a figure that kept him awake at night. He managed the debt carefully, reinvested every profit, and within 5 years the loan was repaid and the gym was thriving. When the time came to expand, Marcus borrowed again, this time $500,000. His friends thought he was insane to take on such a sum, but Marcus had mastered the process. He understood the numbers, had proof of concept, and knew how to manage risk. Today, he owns multiple gyms, valued at several million. Each loan was a rung on the ladder, and his mastery of debt allowed him to climb higher than savings alone ever could have taken him. Mastery also means knowing when not to borrow. The wealthy are not careless. They walk away from loans that do not align with their strategy. Saying no is as important as saying yes. True mastery is selective, deliberate, and patient. A farmer does not plant seeds in frozen ground, and a master of debt does not plant borrowed money in ventures without fertile potential. Perhaps the most important aspect of mastering debt is the shift in identity it creates. When you learn to use debt strategically, you stop seeing yourself as someone who is at the mercy of banks and lenders. Instead, you see yourself as the conductor of the orchestra, directing the flow of borrowed money to create harmony in your financial life. The bank may write the check, but you decide whether it funds a liability or an asset, a drain or a spring. Debt will always exist in the world. Nations borrow, corporations borrow, and individuals borrow. The poor see this and feel trapped, believing debt is unavoidable misery. The rich see the same reality and smile, knowing debt is unavoidable power. The game is not to escape debt, but to master it, to ride its current instead of drowning in its waters. And now, standing with the knowledge you hold, you can choose which face of debt you will embrace. When you make that choice with clarity, discipline, and vision, you step into the same arena as the wealthy, where debt ceases to be a shadow and becomes instead a source of strength. The rules are no longer hidden from you. The game is yours to play.